When a couple of atheists decided to respond to my podcast, Top 10 Questions to Ask an Atheist, and then ask me to respond to their response, I knew it was worthy of my time and attention. Hi, I'm Alec McClellan. This is a Jigsaw Guide to Life. When I released the podcast, Top 10 Questions to Ask an Atheist, Jordan and Jared, on their podcast, Reason to Doubt, decided to interact and try to offer answers to these questions. Let me say right off the bat, I really appreciate these guys. They seem like really nice guys. And this is the kind of exchange that offers hope that we can actually have a conversation, or even by default through our podcasts, that we can interact on some of these issues and we can do it warmly and respectfully. My son, who's in 7th grade, middle school, he looks at the world through the lens of a Christian worldview. And he would share it. Seems to fit. It seems to make sense. But his best friend at school would say he's an atheist. Well, my son Asher and his friend, they have some great conversations. They have some great debates. And then they get on with talking about other things and laughing and joking together. And this is great. This is what we ought to model. This is what we ought to look for. And that is being able to warmly interact with people who see the world differently. Well, Jordan and Jared responded to the podcast, and so I want to respond to their response at their request. Now, that's a challenge for me because my podcasts are 15 minutes long, where theirs was about 45 minutes. So I'm going to split my response into part 1 and part 2. This is going to be part 1, but even then, I need to get moving. But first things first, Jared had suggested that it seems like I'm the kind of person that doesn't like not knowing, and that I'm uncomfortable with saying that I just don't know. Well, Jared, you need to read my book. I've published a book called A Jigsaw Guide to Making Sense of the World. And you'll see in that book, I interact with a lot of these questions, the most difficult questions, and wrestle with these very same things. And I'm really not uncomfortable with not knowing. It just encourages me to dig deeper, to find answers. My background is in philosophy with a special interest in epistemology. So one of the primary things I'm interested in is, what do we know? How do we know? How do we know that we know? And any search for certainty is always going to run into problem, as history has shown. Go back to the 16th century and you read about René Descartes, who sought absolute certainty and ran into difficulty, which was certainly highlighted in the 17th century by David Hume in Scotland, who encouraged this movement towards skepticism. And also then we see in the 18th and 19th centuries the rise of the scientific movement, and we can understand the appeal of this because finally perhaps there was a mechanism by which we could arrive at certainty, until science became scientism, the test for everything, and it failed its own test, which certainly contributed to the slide into postmodernity in the 20th and 21st century. If you look around today, you see that relativism, which flows from postmodernity, is alive and well, as is skepticism. And I come from Scotland. I come from the land of David Hume, and I am no easy believer. In fact, by default, I'm very skeptical about everything. But equally, I am determined to pursue the truth, wherever it leads, whether or not that takes me into uncomfortable areas. The best way to arrive at truth is to keep all options on the table and then make an inference to the best explanation. Now, Jared kind of nailed it without realizing it when he referenced pieces of a puzzle, because that is my epistemological tool that I believe can change the world. I've traveled to over a dozen countries around the world, and I realized that wherever you go, people know that this world is broken. People know that life is confusing. People also know we're never going to find all the answers, which is why many stop asking the questions, until I introduced the jigsaw as an epistemological tool to remind people that, like any jigsaw puzzle, you don't need every piece of the puzzle to see the big picture. You don't need to know everything to know the truth. All you need is enough parts that stand out and snap into place. And if you find enough, you can stand back and say, you know what? I don't know everything, but I really believe I can see the big picture. And that ought to be our goal as we look at life, as we look at this broken world. And with the top 10 questions that I raised, I believe that these are 10 critical pieces of the puzzle. Now, Jordan and Jared may disagree, as they do. They dismiss many of them and say they really don't care. But certainly, if you were to look at the history of the world and to look at the majority of people on this planet, those 10 questions are hugely important and people care deeply. And so I would encourage you to consider them. And if you consider them important, you will find out that atheism as a worldview is found wanting. It doesn't fit. Now, Jared said that my arguments don't prove the existence of God, but if they prove that a godless perspective is insufficient, certainly a godly perspective is worthy of our time and attention. So if you want to know more about how a Christian worldview, how Christian theism gives us the lens to look at life and see things clearly, watch my podcast, Top 10 Questions, Top 10 Answers, how a Christian worldview answers those same questions. Every worldview claims to be the right guide to life, which means that we can test them, and we ought to. My top 10 questions show that atheism is not the right guide to life. It doesn't help us make sense of the world. It doesn't help us make sense of others. It doesn't even help us make sense of ourselves. Well, let me go on now and share a few thoughts with the podcast that Jordan and Jared had shared as they sought to answer my top 10 questions. So again, this is part one of 2 podcasts. Number 10 that I raised of my top 10, number 10 was, how can something come from nothing? How can something come from nothing? You could say this is really beginning at the beginning. And Jordan's answer got my attention because he agreed with me. He said, you don't get something from nothing. Therefore, surely, Jordan, you agree with me that Lawrence Krauss's book is a misnomer in terms of its title. He should change the title. Instead of a universe from nothing, surely he should call this a universe from something, and it wouldn't be controversial. So why does Lawrence Krauss call it a universe from nothing, which, as Jordan pointed out, doesn't make sense? You don't get something from nothing. Well, sometimes to move 2 steps forward, you've got to take 1 step backwards. The traditional definition of universe comes from the Latin all things, and many scientists believe that all that exists is time, space, and matter. Many of those same scientists believe that the universe began to exist. Now, if the universe began to exist, the universe cannot bring itself into existence. It wasn't around at the time. So what was responsible for the universe? What was the cause of the universe? Well, if these same scientists have posited that all exists is time, space, and matter, and the universe began to exist, nothing exists outside of the universe, well, the universe came from nothing. Why would they conclude that when that doesn't make sense? You don't get something from nothing. Well, think about it. If all that exists is time, space, and matter, what is responsible for the beginning of these things would have to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial. You could argue very powerful. You could even add on personal. And maybe you start to see where this takes people. Certainly it's the one place atheists do not want to go. So they fall back on this. We have a universe from nothing, which doesn't make sense. And they know it doesn't make any sense. So they subtly redefine nothing as something to wriggle out of an uncomfortable situation. Something from someone makes a lot more sense than something from nothing. How do you get something from nothing? Well, it's one reason why atheism as a worldview doesn't fit. Number 9, how can you get life from non-life? How can you get life from non-life? Now, Jordan questioned a quote that I used from a publication called Scientific American. He said as a student, they had been tasked with critiquing an article that was very disappointing. Well, let me read a brief description of Scientific American. It is the longest running scientific publication. And so, first published in 1845, Scientific American is the leading source and authority for science, technology, information, and policy for a general audience. More than 150 Nobel laureates have written for Scientific American. Note, these are not academic journals, but magazines with reports on stories of interest to the public, sourced from peer-reviewed academic peers and various journals. Now, I don't really have to defend the honour of Scientific American, largely because Jordan didn't question the quote that I used, which is unsurprising because it wasn't controversial. I was merely pointing out that scientists who look at life coming from non-life and looking for a natural explanation are left scratching their heads because they just don't know how this happened. Now, Jordan briefly argued that life comes from non-life all the time. Every time we eat a hamburger, I'm not quite sure where to go with this. I don't know if he was being completely serious, but largely, for the most part, Jordan did consider this seriously when he talked about abiogenesis. But it sounded like he was alluding to the Miller-Urey experiment from the 1950s, which would be a surprise because this experiment has been largely discredited. Why? Well, what we know now about early Earth's atmosphere shows that this experiment actually doesn't match up. And also the compounds that were created, they certainly fall far short of what would be necessary for life. But then Jared jumped in and said, well, it's not that hard to conceive of. We're all chemicals. Life is just chemicals. So put the right chemicals in the right place at the right time, and there's the right reaction. Boom. Jared, I can only say this. You are a man of faith. Massive faith. Far greater faith than I have. You don't have to dig too deep to know that science naturally has no answer for how life came from non-life. But here's the key thing. All the information that we do have, all the things that we do know, show that life comes from life. So if you're making an inference to the best explanation, that ought to be your conclusion. How do you get life from non-life? Naturally, atheism doesn't have the answer. Atheism doesn't fit. Well, number 8, how does mind come from matter? How does mind come from matter? Consciousness is an amazing reality, something that we kind of take for granted. Jordan said maybe it's an emergent property. It just squirts into existence, but it certainly doesn't really answer the question. And then Jordan also talked about the relationship between the mind and the brain. It seems bizarre to think of a mind existing without a brain. Now, there's certainly a special relationship between the mind and the brain, but that doesn't mean that the mind is identical to the brain. In fact, there's many things we know about our consciousness that shows that the mind can't be identical to the brain. Some things cannot be reduced to brain chemistry. Think of beauty or justice or courage or kindness or compassion. The experience of loving or being loved is just a chemical cocktail. Jared suggested that even very basic life forms have conscious experience, but we don't know. We don't know what's going on inside any other living thing. As Jordan pointed out, we don't even know if other people are conscious. But as C.S. Lewis said, human beings, we do get an inside look. And also what is fascinating is that even as you're watching this podcast and as I'm delivering this podcast, there's a sense that I'm in here looking at you out there. There's a sense of self that seems undeniable, that we are conscious beings. But how does the mind emerge from matter? Atheism just doesn't fit. Well, I'll pick up the rest in the second part of the podcast, but I just want to say thank you again to Jordan and Jared for interacting on these questions. But as a conclusion, you see that atheism is a worldview found wanting.